forgotten the sitting order.
There we go. All right, welcome everybody to this panel on collaborative game dev, bridging disciplines. Going to start out by just introducing each of our guests here, all of whom are GA grads from really, I think, across the scope of that 10 years that we're celebrating this year with our 10-year anniversary. So if we can go maybe right to left along the line of our industry guests here, and if you could all say a little bit about what your current role is, what you're working on, and also when you graduated from the GA, that would be awesome.
Okay. Hi, I'm Cassy Cornish. I'm a junior game designer at Ballistic Moon, currently working on the remaster of Until Dawn, and I graduated last year, so I was in the EXPO shoes just a year ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. My name is Robin Arthur Greenwood. I'm a junior concept artist at Ubisoft, working on an unannounced new IP. I graduated in 2018 from the game development course on the art route. I'll pass it over.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Elise Dennis. I graduated 2 years ago. I work for Behaviour UK South, based in Truro, very local. And I'm working on an unannounced game also. You may know it's like things like Dead by Daylight, etc. Yeah, it's been good having like on a panel with a bunch of alum.
Great.
Oh my God. My name is Rebecca Haigh. I'm a scriptwriter at Playground Games working on Fable. I've been there for about 5 years. Like Robin, I graduated in 2018, so it's been a hot minute.
My name's Tom Coveney. I'm currently working at Rocksteady Studios, making the Suicide Squad and a couple of unannounced projects. And I was one of on the first cohort through the games course, so I graduated in 2017. So
Older than me.
the senior.
It certainly wasn't an event like this back then, was it?
No, there was not.
Yes.
No, we showed some videos in Falmouth Cinema.
Yes,
We got the cinema experience.
Yeah.
All right, thanks very much, everybody. So our panel today is about collaborative game dev and bridging across our disciplines. So I'd like to kick off by talking a little bit about those disciplines. I think we've got a really interesting range of different roles and disciplines represented today in the panel. So our first question is around your role. So what you guys tend to prioritize more compared to people in other roles. We've got some designers, we've got writers, we've got some artists. So it would be really cool to go perhaps again right to left along our lineup here and talk a little bit about that role that you do, your specialism.
Okay. So as I said, I'm a designer working on Until Dawn Remaster, and it isn't just a case of, unfortunately, going in editor and pressing HD on all the textures, sadly. We've converted the game from Decima Engine to Unreal, so there was a lot of work going into unplugging everything, plugging it all back in again, translating it between things. And a lot of my work is, I've worked on a few things, the interactions, cameras, QTEs at the moment. And I suppose compared to other disciplines, we kind of have to know the game inside out. Someone could send a screenshot and go, does anyone know what this is from? And I will probably know the exact cutscene it's from. Design is often treated a bit like an in-between of some disciplines, and as such, you do know the kind of overall game. Some people say that design is a bit like the glue between other disciplines sometimes, but even though it isn't that on paper, you kind of end up becoming that as well, just from having to know things inside and out. So yeah, we're a bit like the wiki page for our game and team sometimes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that leads really nicely into concept, because I hear what you say about like being like a glue between teams, because concept, something that I've found like working at Ubisoft is treating the team almost like a service team. And so I end up working a lot for other teams and sort of like bridging between different art disciplines, narrative and design. Something that's unique, obviously, to concept art is we're creating a lot of the initial visuals that go into different disciplines. We are often given briefs. Pretty much everything we do is a brief, either from art direction or from narrative, design, or character, and that's something we then visualize. And that can come in any form, all the way from like sort of character posing, iteration of animation, all the way through to like key art, high key, sort of like visual stuff. But yeah, my role specifically, I've mostly focused on character concept art. So a lot of my stuff, I predominantly work with character art and animation and narrative as well. So yeah, that's kind of where I find myself at the moment. How about you?
Yeah, that like really leads on well to my role. So just for clarification again, I'm a level designer, and we have this sort of weird in between of being at the end of the product and the start of the product and everywhere in between. Sometimes we can come up at the very end of a project and we are just literally adding to what already exists. And sometimes we have to start from absolute paper and absolute nothing. And the interesting thing about being a level designer is obviously we create the playable space, but not only for the players, but also for the other devs to kind of realize our ideas. And like, it's mainly about ideation, which leads into your role with concepts. And a lot of my day is looking at concept art, taking it, and then making the very first visualization of what that's going to be in the game. So the main thing with that, in terms of working with other developers, is ensuring it's communicated well and it comes across really closely with like the intent of what we want with that space. So that's not just making it out of cubes, it's also like adding little bits to give it a sense of feeling, atmosphere, and then also adding notes of like, what do we think could be here, what do we think should be here, and like what's very important for gameplay moments, not only for the player, but also for narrative, and just keeping that sort of consistency going. And then sometimes we do the first ideation, it doesn't really go too well, and we need to go back to concept. So we'll go into communication with like concept artists, directors, narrative, anyone really, and we'll get those ideas brewing in the ideation. We'll work with game designers to into a cohesive package and deliver it with the first like playable level. And then that process keeps going on, reiterating, and it keeps getting refined until the game's shippable and it's launched, essentially.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess speaking of narrative, it brings you on to
It's funny that I knew that as soon as someone mentioned my discipline is the glue, that there were going to be at least 3 of us that were going to be like, we're the glue, narrative's the glue. But you end up collaborating massively with all of the other disciplines. That's how you spend most of your time. A huge amount of your time is spent in meetings. We game developers love meetings because you're never really working on something on your own. You're constantly working either in your own discipline, which tends to be in a team. You're rarely the only one on your own, or it's in multidiscipline, like strike teams that are working on something. Communication is absolutely key. I spend most of my day either in Excel, Microsoft Teams, or in meetings. All I can think of is Microsoft Excel. All I've been doing is Microsoft Excel all year. But one of the most important things that we do, as was discussed over here, like we work really closely with these guys. And it completely depends on the project where narrative's place is within that kind of like hierarchy or ecosystem. If it's a narrative-led project, then we are sending out briefs to other disciplines. We are setting the documentation, setting the world lore, the lore Bible. Or if it's not a narrative-led, which was something that I've previously worked on, it's reactive. You are filling in gaps. You are literally the glue plugging like design systems together and making things make sense. There is a preference. It's the first one.
Yeah, so I mean, Elise already touched on what we do as level designers. We're kind of responsible for the sort of bucket that everything else gets poured into a lot of the time. Although also it's another role that can change a lot based on the project and the style of game you're making. But in the games that I've been responsible for, everything's kind of coming together and being stitched together in the level. Like that's the context in which you experience all the other kind of elements. So you obviously have to collaborate with all the other disciplines whose elements you are using. But the bit that we tend to be mindful of uniquely is trying to preserve that initial design intent of the space, because it's quite easy for things to get muddied or for the player to get pulled in a lot of different directions. Like the more bells and whistles and pretty things you add in, if they're not pulling together in the right directions, then it can be a distraction, kind of end up as just noise, right? So it's kind of, you tend to be the one who has the oversight over how all those things are fitting together, and trying to preserve what you initially wanted the player to go over there instead of getting distracted by loud noises from the audio team.
Perfect example.
Or kind of, yeah. Yeah, keeping that kind of initial vision true.
That concept of noise, or the sort of everybody's best efforts going into a blender and not cohering well, is really interesting, and I definitely want to come back to that idea later on. I actually think, Rebecca, you said something interesting about Excel, because I think a lot of people's idea of what being a game writer isn't that. It's, I'm going to sit down and type my magnum opus law Bible and then put that on the table and everybody else will read it. So
That would be nice.
I think an interesting next question would be to dig into those elements that maybe get a bit misunderstood, because the students are obviously working through their modules. They've got a little bit of a taste of what these different roles look like through module assignments. And there's a limited extent to which, even with our staff best efforts, those module assignments can fully mirror the realities of doing these roles in industry. So I think it's going to be really interesting for our students to talk about and dig into a few of those perhaps misconceptions. Maybe I think an interesting lens into this could be what things really surprised you? What coming out of uni and that preparation in the GA, what surprised you about your roles? Which elements ended up being a bit more prominent than you thought? And what are the misconceptions that you think the public have about your roles? Maybe we could dig into that Excel thing a little bit, Rebecca.
Now?
Or we can
No,
dig in
it's fine.
Otherwise, yeah.
It's the most interesting things anyone said about Excel for several years.
I know. So, you said it on the nose. There is this conception that writers kind of like lock themselves in a room, writing room. Things are done very differently in, say, like TV, film, and animation than they are in games. The concept of a writing room, depending on the studio, you're lucky if you have one. You need to get really good at writing on an open plan floor. With everyone talking around you, people pitching stuff, scrum meetings going on. And you also have to get really, really, very, very good at making things quickly, putting them in front of people, and getting it scrapped. And that is just a huge part of our jobs, is the output of work you do is not reflective in any way of the final of the work. The amount of work that gets put into and gets churned and gets put on a wall, scrapped, taken down, put back up again. You have to get used to that. And there is very much a self-hardening process that you have to go through when you first join a studio, which as creatives and artists can be really hard to get over. Like that, I would say, is probably your first obstacle, is not being precious. Accepting the fact that you don't know everything, and taking feedback from people that don't understand the work that you do. And learning that language will help you survive a long time. And that is hard to do. It's really hard to do. So no, we're not all on our typewriters or with our quills, even though a lot of people in the games industry, even in the industry, think that's what we do.
Yeah.
It's Excel, it's not sexy. You can make them look sexy, which does help. But you do spend a huge amount of time putting stuff out. It is just writing. You have to get stuff down on the page as fast as you can, as best as you can, with as much collaboration as you can, which, you know, speaking to the writers in the room or anyone with an interest in writing or writer's background, we are so accustomed to working by ourselves, in our rooms, on our novel projects, on our Pinterest boards, on our journals, on our mind maps, that as soon as we get into a space where I am then putting that in front of a group of like potentially 15 people and everyone has a opinion, that's hard. You get used to it, but I will say that is one of the first sort of culture or even creative shocks of going into the industry as a writer. And I know that it's not just writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that goes for pretty much any discipline that I know of so far. Yeah, you get very used to your ideas are not precious. They might lead to something that's great, but that initial moment where you kind of go, hey, here's what I think we should do, is not something you can get attached to.
No, because they'll take it out back and shoot it, and that's
Yes.
okay. You have to accept
And
that.
sometimes it needs to be done.
Yes.
And sometimes it shouldn't have been done, but it was done by someone who's far more senior than you, and you need to accept it anyway.
And gets
and move
paid a
on.
lot more.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it's interesting from an educator's point of view because, of course, in the student team, we have to make sure everybody's work gets represented, and somebody
100%.
can come up to me as a supervisor and say, "Hey, they took my work out. This is an outrage," and I'll do my best to get that person's work back in so that it can be shown off.
Yeah,
But
you can't
in
say maybe your work
industry-
wasn't good enough.
Yeah, in industry, it's very different for sure. In my freelancing in industry, then popping back into the classroom setting, I think that's one of the big differences that I notice is that sense of the massive group input into one's own work, which I know across all of our disciplines, that's definitely going to be a big factor. Is there anything else that you guys would like to feed into in terms of not just that collaboration aspect, but also the misunderstandings that people might have about your different roles?
Yeah. I think design can be quite a varied field, especially general game design. And, a lot of people, when they're getting ready for a design interview, especially in Unreal, you work on your blueprint skills, your coding blueprint skills. I haven't had to use that much at all. A lot of my stuff is checking boxes and altering values in engine and then doing it over and over again to make sure it works. Basically, there's a lot more repetition than there was in student stuff. You do something, you go, okay, that's cool, add it to Git. But no, you do something, you've got to check it a couple times to make sure it works. You check on different configurations of controls, of graphics. You've got to make sure it works because you don't want to be the one who breaks the build. Not in industry, you don't want to be the one who does that. So I guess it's a lot more repetitive than I expected, but I understand fully why it has to be. You also spend a lot more time looking at databases and documents than I expected. You do cover game design documents in the course, but that kind of stuff happens for basically every feature in the game, at least at our studio, because our team is like 70-ish, I think, and especially because about half the studio, I think, work remotely or hybrid. I work remotely here from here in Cornwall, and if someone opens up the editor and goes, "What is this?" they need to know everything about it, and even if it's as simple as you've gone in and done a pass on the cameras in a scene, you need to sort of have proof of why you did what you did. If you were sick and someone needs to do the cameras on the next scene, you want it to be consistent, and they don't know what was going through your mind when you did it. So standardizing things is quite a common practice, and everything needs to be evidenced and written down. And you also spend a lot of time online, in our case at least, in bug databases, getting tagged in bugs and sorting them, because especially with design, regardless of the gluiness or not of it, we're basically the discipline, I'd say, that is in the level the most often. Even if you aren't a level designer, we're the ones who are in the game the most. Programmers are working on the back end, artists are working in Maya and stuff like that. But we are in the game the most often. So you see things most often. You're most likely to change something that people notice very often. Basically, everything is seen, everything is evidence. You've got to be super careful and make extra sure. Because QA can catch things, but they've got a lot of stuff to do. So you've got to make sure the work you put in is good quality. And even if it's a minimal change, you don't want it to mess up something for someone else. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bounce off that quickly and just say, it's really interesting that you say, you've got to work, so standardized across the entire project, and that is true. One thing that I think is a bit different almost in LD is sometimes with being people that are in the levels the most, play the most, and playing through the same level hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, we notice a lot of these kind of intricate niches that people may not notice.
Yeah.
And quite often, I don't know in your case, but in my case, I ended up doing work that wasn't necessarily approved. and then proposing it to someone, and then they'll look at it and be like, actually, that's a really good idea, or we should maybe adjust this.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to stay standardized, like you said, but I think it's also important to kind of push that boundary and try and almost think 3 steps ahead if you can. So you can kind of future-proof the game experience for everyone else. But I think what's really interesting about being in LD is you need to understand every single working cog in a game to be able to work like efficiently. And going back to what you two said, something one of my leads originally told me in the first few months where I started working in industry was just the phrase "kill your darlings." And it's so true. There was so many things I made that I was so proud of, and I wanted to show off to everyone. I thought it was absolutely amazing, but it just wasn't in scope. It was in tech debt. My lead didn't think it was in like narrative, or in line with the narrative. Sorry, or there was just some reason that I wasn't aware of. And then as I matured and grew in industry and gained more experience, I started to learn more about the different aspects of the game, every single department, and then understanding more of those moving cogs, and started to realize why that thing I really wanted to do before that was super cool in my eyes wasn't possible. And it's just being aware of like everything that's ongoing. And that means talking to everybody. Like you need to communicate so much. I think my day is, I work an 8-hour day. I spend about 5 hours of that in meetings. My mornings is just work, and then afternoons just meetings. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump off that as well. Coming from independently sort of like creating my portfolio after work and then like into doing concept art full time, like the things that it's almost like you're doing the portfolio and then you're doing the job, and they're like 2 wildly different things, because portfolios can have this like element, which I'm sure Phoebe can speak to, about pretty pictures and then making it attractive, and concept art can very easily fall into that like pretty picture element, that sort of like key art, really flashy stuff, where more often than not we are like in the weeds, like working with design, working with level, with narrative, we're trying to figure stuff out in the most effective way to save everyone time. And that's sort of the main thing that concept art does, and sort of the biggest misconception. And then the other half that I didn't expect when I started my role was just a combination of how long things take and how much you're working and how many stakeholders you have, how long those things take. I've worked on character designs that have taken months, and when you're working on it for your portfolio, it's like, oh, well, I'm doing this iteration and then I'm coming to this final piece, and the final piece is like a future thing. It's not even something you're doing, it's something 3D's doing, and they've started and you're integrating with them. You're doing research for them and then they're integrating back to you, and it's not as clear cut as what it felt like working on a portfolio, which was sort of this start, middle and end. It's this continuous cycle of working on designs with all of these disciplines. And having, like Rebecca mentioned in these different meetings, having like 5 or 6 stakeholders and having to be beholden to brand and narrative and multiple art directors and multiple design directors perhaps, and each of them definitely having input is something you just can't learn until you're in it, and you have to learn whose voice is loudest, and it's a whole thing. I think it's really amazing how everyone here has disciplines that weave, and I think we've all been able to echo the experience of how much more collaborative our jobs are than we maybe first thought.
I think this isn't like time for advice, like pearls of wisdom, handing them out. But I think after what everyone has said is like, the job that you're going in to do isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Mm-hmm. And that means that you've got to be super passionate and super into the very niche thing that you want to go and do. So if you're a lighting artist, love lighting, man, like really love it. If you're a character artist, go and do that, live and breathe it, because it's not a sprint. It is a long marathon to get to a collective final product. Mm-hmm. And it's the product that's key. It's the end point that matters.
Yeah, you're all working towards one thing together.
Yes.
It's important.
And then we get to have a big party about it when we
Yeah, I think something as well is worth mentioning on that point is like when working in this kind of like cross-collaborative environment and you're working on so many different things, so I think it's really important, especially in larger teams, choose your battles wisely. Don't spend weeks and weeks working on this one little niche thing that you think is really cool that doesn't actually have much of an impact on everything. Work on something that's going to be useful to everyone else, the team, the final product, so you can hand it off so people have those conversations and eventually just up the quality of the product.
Prioritizing is a very real
Yes,
thing.
it is. Yeah.
Great. So I want to leave us 5 minutes for questions at the end. But I think a really great next topic to move into is really building off what we've just been talking about, which is common collaborations that you guys often run into. So obviously, as the audience have just heard, everybody here spends a lot of time talking in meetings to everybody, but there are also going to be other disciplines which your discipline has great synergy with, who you're often collaborating with, where there are particular things that the students might be able to learn about those collaborations. I don't know if anybody would like to get started talking about something like that.
I can jump in, or did you want to? Are you sure? For concept art, for me, it depends if you're doing environments, characters, or props, and that sort of depends who in probably 3D that you're heavily linking to. It could be world artists, it could be weapons and prop and vehicle artists. For me, it's predominantly character art. I'd say over half of my meetings, I am in with the character artists. We're over at each other's desks. When they're 3D modeling from my concepts, either I've done a turnaround or we haven't even got to the turnaround and they've started. And so that they can keep moving, they can use me as someone who can get them more research, more material reference. We are constantly going back and forth. I think character art is who I collaborate with the most. And then secondary is narrative, especially when I'm creating characters that are going to have a narrative focus, constantly checking in with them that what I'm creating hits the right notes for their bio, hits the right notes for anything that we want to use that character for, and just is consistent really with the narrative that we want to convey. I'll pass on to anyone else. So Tom, you were going to say something as well.
Yeah, it depends a lot based on the project as level design, because exactly what a level look like is going to be very different from one game type to another. The two constants, I reckon, are always the art team and the code team. So art are trying to make the same spaces that we essentially.
At the same time.
Often at the same time, yes. That can be. You need to curate a very understanding relationship with your art team. It's going to benefit everyone in the long run, because it is possible that you can end up trying to pull in different directions. Like if you get into a position where what looks good is different to what you feel is going to play well, then you've kind of got a problem and you need to figure out how to come to some compromise about that. And it's normally, in most years, going to be what plays well and gets sticks, and kind of I'll have to figure out a way around it, but they're not always going to feel that way about it. And so there can be some difficult conversations. So it's worth just having a very, very friendly relationship right from the beginning. And then code. So code tend to make the tools, and as level designer, you tend to implement those tools and use them in the game. So sometimes it's a case of you're almost the like end user for the things that they're going to make. So you're requesting tools and requesting changes and kind of informing them what would be useful. Because in my experience, a programmer really likes just a very detailed brief. They don't tend to like a lot of wiggle room. They're like, just tell me the things make, and I can make the thing. So that's the kind of relationship you tend to have with code. Or reporting back what would be useful, or they might add in some little bells and whistles that you didn't expect, and they'll tell you how to use them, and that's great. But and it'll interact with all the other disciplines as well, but those are like always the fundamental kind of building blocks in my experience with level design.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to talk about programming, given that we don't have any representation from that discipline on the panel. I think I'm going to make the executive decision that we're going to carry on having this interesting conversation, and if anybody has questions for our panel, please catch us outside.
Okay.
And if anybody else has anything they'd like to kind of contribute on this topic, given we've got about 5 minutes left on the clock.
I can add something quickly just to bounce off you. Yeah, like Tom said, for people that don't know, we used to work together, and we have experienced a double-bladed environment with the art team, and it's not fun. Like you're trying to make something, they push in the other direction, they're trying to make something. In the end, you kind of just make something that's a weird mix of the both and it just doesn't work. So it's really important to get that like very initial friendliness going. And one thing that we do in our studio, for example, is we often base our environments, both LD and art, off the concepts, and we have those conversations with narrative simultaneously. And we try and get it right on the first time. And if we don't, we iterate. And we keep going, we keep iterating until everybody's happy. And if something is going right or there's some tension building, you nip it in the bud immediately. Like, we have that conversation. There's no like, oh, I hate this person behind a wall or something. There's no like jaded expressions, you know. It's just everyone's working on the same product at the end of the day, so you need to work simultaneously and harmlessly. And if that isn't working, you need to address it like instantly.
Yeah, I think, you know, something that we've kind of all shown here is that something I suppose you don't expect so much is that, yeah, everything happens at once. There isn't an order. We're encouraged at uni to be iterative in our process because you have to be. In the industry, you're making something based on something that is probably already out of date by the time you submit it. Like, everything is getting interwoven, I'm not sure the word, at once. So you need to keep making passes and iterations because it's always changing. You know, if a level block out with the art, it changes the space. And you know, in my work, we're working based on what the engineers have set up for us, but their code changes, so you may need to rework your stuff. It's just iterative, and you can't be mad that you need to revisit something because it's just these changes were made for a reason, and it's all just to improve the quality of the game you're making.
I mean, yeah, I can quickly jump on that as well in terms of like having things remade and having to go in and rework. I think there's a misconception that concept sort of comes at the start and that's where you happen. And there is an element of that we tend to be X amount of time ahead in the sense, so it can sort of go down a waterfall pipeline, but that doesn't always happen and definitely isn't always the case. I've absolutely had to go back and rework concepts, rework characters, rework props, especially when it comes to in-world things and iterations on levels and things like that, having to provide quick and dirty concepts that answer and solve problems, because that's just kind of what the whole role is trying to solve problems for everyone else to keep everything moving. And it's constant all the way up until the end. And yeah, that's kind of the fun of it as well. We're still stuck in.
To finish it off then, I suppose, given the time. I mean, we've talked a lot about it. Narrative has come up a few times. As Tom said, it's entirely based on the project that you're working on. It completely depends who you are working with and what you're working with those people on. Fable's an RPG. So you can make executive decisions on who our nearest and dearest are. And so we work daily with the quest design team, dialogue and audio teams, cinematics. As Rob said, Rob and I are partners, we're together, and it's really helpful having a concept artist at home because I work with concept art a lot. I have an understanding of Rob's job. It's really hard to say. Rob has an understanding of my job, and so that makes collaborating with our in-house teams so much easier because we're already able to speak each other's languages. But yeah, I think we're all friendly on these sofas.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Departmentally.
An underestimated part of being a games developer.
Yes.
Is being friendly and personable.
And nice.
Because you're going to need to work with people
Yeah.
and not really annoy them all the time.
Yes. And a bit of that give and take, isn't it? Which I think everybody on the panel's been talking about. You know. Okay, well, looking at our timer, I think I just have time to thank the panel and hope that you as the audience have found this to be an interesting discussion. I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions, but please feel very free to catch anybody
absolutely.
and ask those questions. I'm sure everybody would be keen to have a chat.
For sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.